While interacting with large language models like ChatGPT or Gemini, we have seen that the responses are printed as and when they are generated, and you don't have to wait for the complete response. So how do you do that in your Next.js application? When you hit these large language models using API, the responses do take time to generate, but you don't have to wait for the generation to complete before showing it to the user. If you want to stream responses in real time in your Next.js application, then in this video I'm going to show you everything there is to it. We are going to build this Next.js application that streams responses as and when they're generated, shows an indicator when generation is in process, and allows us to quit the generation in the middle of a sentence. We are going to use the Gemini Pro API as our choice of large language model and style our app using Tailwind CSS. And if you stick to the end, I'm going to show you how you can make your app look from this to this using Markdowns. We'll build this app from scratch, but the video is appropriately timestamped for all the sections. So if you want to quickly get to what you're looking for, then feel free to skip ahead. As a prerequisite to any Next.js application, you need Node.js installed on your machine. We will create a Google AI Studio API key in this video. It's free and doesn't require any credit card information. So let's start building. We are going to start by creating a new folder on our desktop, and we are going to call it Gemini Stream, and I'm going to drag and drop it onto the VS Code icon. Here I'm going to write npx create next app @latest.slash. So it creates it inside this specified directory itself, and it is not going to ask for a name for this project. The directory name defines the project name, and I'm going to use the defaults here. So you can check the default configurations that I've used. I'm not using any source directory, and I'm not changing the default import alias for this. So after that is done, I'm going to go to this app directory and onto the page.tsx file and get rid of everything that is inside this main tag. And I'm also going to delete this justify between, and I'm going to give a padding of 12 to my page. And just to see everything is working correctly, I'm going to write hello world and bring up the service by writing npm run dev, and that's going to open it up in the localhost 3000. I'm going to command click on this so that it opens it up in the default browser. So as you can see, it comes with default styling in the background, slight gray color. That actually comes with the boilerplate code that we installed by writing the npx create next app command. So I'm going to go to the global.css file and remove this background attribute of the body. After I save it, when I go back, it's completely white. So I've set up my project window like this. On the right side, I have the browser window open, and on the left side, I have Visual Studio Code. I'll be making changes in this Visual Studio Code, and as soon as I save it, React is going to hot reload the changes, and I'll be able to see the changes live on the right side. So I'll start building the UI first, and there will be two things. On top, there will be a form element, and just below that, there will be the rendering of the messages that we'll be receiving from the AI. For this, just to give a structure to my code, I'm going to create them as functions. So I'm going to write render form and render messages. So I'm going to create these functions inside this outer component. So I'm going to write inner render functions, function render form, and it's going to return a form element. And for the render messages, I'm just going to return a div for now. So using these functions, we are giving a more structure to our code, and for the form, we'll have two items. On top, there will be an input where the user will be typing in their prompt, and right beside that, there will be a send button. That will be all for the form. So I'm going to give it an input tag first. I'll give it a placeholder, ask something, and just right after that, I'm going to write button, which will be of type submit, so that when the user clicks on this button, we want the form to be submitted. And if the user hits enter inside this input text box, that time also the form will be submitted. I'm just going to write send for now for the button. And what we actually want to do is that we want to show a send icon here. And for that, I'm going to install Lucid React. So I'm going to stop the service by hitting Ctrl+C, Command K to clear the terminal window, and then write npm install Lucid React. This is one of the most popular icon packages that you can use for your Next.js application. And in place of send, I'm going to write send and hit tab. That is going to auto import it from the Lucid React. As you can see, the send icon got auto imported from Lucid React. And then if we save it and then bring up the service by writing npm run dev and refresh it, you'll see the send icon is there. Now let me go ahead and give this form input and button some styling using Tailwind CSS classes so that it starts looking better. So for the form, I'm going to write class name width full flex row so that the input and the button are placed horizontally, and within them I'm going to give it a gap of 2 items centered so that at least they are center aligned, and height of full. For the input, I'm going to give it a class name of border B so that there is a bottom border. I'm going to make the border dashed, outline none, so that when we click on this outline does not come up. So now after saving, this will not come up. I'm going to give it width full, padding X of 4, padding Y of 2. I'm going to give it a specific text color. So this is the blue color that I'm going to use. And for the placeholder as well, I'm going to use the same color. So I'm going to write placeholder. But if we add 2 more characters after the hex code, that can range from 00, which is completely transparent, to FF, which is completely opaque. And if we say something in between, that is 99, that will have a blue color with a slight transparency. So that is what I'm going to use here. I'm also going to say text right so that we start typing from the right side. And I don't like the fact that whenever we have placed our cursor inside the input text box, the placeholder still remains. To change that, I'm going to say focus. When it is in focus, placeholder should be transparent. So that way, whenever we are placing our cursor inside the text box, the placeholder vanishes. For the button, I'm going to give it a class name of rounded because it will be a rounded button, rounded full rather. I'm going to give it a shadow MD, border, flex row. And for the icon, I'm going to give it padding of 3, height of 10, and width of 10. And I'm going to change the color from black to a little more subtle color. That is, I'm going to use stroke stone 500. So these are the colors that comes with Tailwind in the form of utility classes. That is what I'm going to use here. So you can see the hex code that is assigned to it. That's going to change the color of the icon a little bit. So our form is built. Now let's go ahead and work on the streaming feature. Okay, so now we are ready to build the streaming feature. So to build the streaming feature, I'm going to go ahead to the sdk.vercel.ai/docs, and I'm going to go ahead in the built-in adapters section. So this is a npm package or SDK that we are going to use to build this streaming feature, and this comes from Vercel itself. So as you know that Vercel is the company that is behind Next.js, and this is coming right from them. So as you can see, they have built-in adapters for Hugging Face, LangChain, Mr. AI, OpenAI, Google, all sorts of things. So the way you'll be implementing for all these use cases is going to be pretty similar. The implementation has 2 parts. One is on the API side and the another is on the UI side. So the API side is going to be pretty similar to implementing any Next.js post API that you might have written before, with one exception, that the post handler has to return a streaming text response. So if you were to create a traditional Next.js API post handler, you'd probably return a next response or a response object, but in this specific case it has to be a streaming text response object, which you'll be getting from by installing this npm package. And on the UI side, they have created 2 lifecycle hooks called useChat and useCompletion. They both work on the principle of managing states internally and exposing handlers to interact with those states. By that, what I mean is that, so if you see the example of useChat, as you can see, they have this structure to get 4 handlers, that is messages, input, handle input change, handle submit. There are many other handlers that you can get from useChat documentation, and same goes for useCompletion, but these are the 4 main handlers that you'll be using. So the messages is a JSON array object that stores all the messages that has gone back and forth between the API and the client. So if you are familiar with a multi-turn chat use case, you know that whenever you receive a response from the assistant, that message gets tagged with the role of assistant, and whenever a user types in a message, that message gets tagged with the role user, and all those messages that has gone back and forth between the client and the assistant gets stored in this messages array. And when you will be submitting the form or when you'll be sending an API request to the API that will be specifying, this messages array gets sent as a payload to that post request. So you'll be using this handle submit method to send this post request to the the API that we will be specifying. And whenever you send that post request, this messages array gets sent by default as a payload. And this input and handle input change methods will be used to bind the input text box in which the user will be typing in their responses. So if you were to build it in a traditional Next.js way, probably you will create a input state variable, and that will come with a set input method, and you'll be doing a two-way binding by making sure that the value is bound with the input value, and the onChange method of the input text is bound with the set input method that gets created when you're creating this input state. But in this case, that internal state management is handled by this SDK itself. The reason that is required is that whenever you will be clicking on submit or hitting enter, this input value has to be pushed into this messages array before sending this post request to this API. You could write it in a traditional way where you'd be pushing this input value inside this messages array. The messages array state you'd be maintaining yourself, and you'd be making a post request to this backend API using your own post method implemented using fetch or Axios. But all those things are managed internally, and you can interact with them very easily using these handlers that are exposed. So by using these handlers, you can wire up the relevant UI elements very easily and implement this streaming feature. With that overall plan, I'm going to go ahead and install this AI SDK. So in my project, I'm going to stop this service by hitting Ctrl+C and then Command K to clear the terminal window. And then I'm going to write npm i AI. So after that is installed, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this line since we have already installed this package. So I'm going to paste it on top of here. First thing, we'll have to import it from AI React. And another thing is that this is UI only. So we'll have to write use client directive. After this is done, I'm going to wire this input and handle input change with the input that we have created. So I'm going to say value is equal to input and onChange is equal to handle input change. That is going to make sure that whenever this input has changed and whenever you are submitting the form, this input gets pushed into this messages array before sending it to the API. And this useChat actually expects config object, and you can specify the API name. So by default, it tries to look for the API with the name API/chat. In most cases, you will probably use a more descriptive name, and in our case, I'll be naming my API with API/GenAI. And whenever you'll be using the handle submit, it's going to make sure that this is going to send a post request to this specific API. Now we can bind this handle submit with our on submit method of our form. So I'm going to delete this action and on submit. I'm going to handle submit. We can just directly write this handle submit here, and that way the default payload, that is the messages, is going to be submitted whenever we are sending the post request. But I'm going to show you how you can send additional payload. For that, you'll have to call this handle submit method explicitly, and we're not just going to bind it like this. So I'm going to create a lambda function for this. Obviously this is going to be called with the event of type form event because this is on submit method, and that is required because when you will be calling this handle submit method, that expects a form event. So first thing what we'll do is that event.prevent default, and then we'll be calling handle submit, and as a first argument it expects the event, and then the second argument can be the additional payload that you want to send alongside the messages that is already being sent by default. So I'm going to write data, and this can be any JSON object with any key value pair. So I'm going to name my key as prompt, and the value I'm going to send the input only, the input that the user has just typed in and entered. If this is not clear at this moment, it is going to be absolutely clear when I'm going to go ahead and build this API where I'll be console logging the payload that we received from the post request. Then you'll be able to see exactly what payload we are receiving as part of the post request. So let me go ahead and build that. So I'm going to go into the app directory and click on new file and write API / that is how we want to name our API /route.ts. And this is just going to create a folder structure. So inside app, this is going to create a API directory. Inside that, this is going to create a Gemini directory and then a route.ts file. And this folder structure is going to make sure that this API/GenAI path exists as an API. Here I'm going to export an async post function, which is very similar to any usual Next.js post handler. So I'm going to write async function with the name post, and this is going to take as parameter request of type request. request and response of type response. This is very similar to any Next.js API that you might have created before. And while returning, you usually return a next response or a new response object, but in this case it has to be a new streaming text response object. So I'm going to write return new streaming text response. While instantiating this object, it expects, as you can see, it expects a readable stream. We haven't received that yet, so I'm going to comment this out now. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to get this payload out of this request body. So let me do that. Let me write const request body is equal to request.json, and this is an async call, so we'll have to await it. And I'm going to go ahead and console log it. Now, since we are not returning anything from our post handler, this is going to throw an error. But before that, we are console logging the request body. So the intention of this is that to check what payload we are receiving as part of this post request. So let me go ahead and run this service by writing npm run dev. And I'm going to refresh this page and write. And as you can see, it has thrown an error that no response returned from the route handler. That is fine, but we have console logged it, and as you can see that we have actually received the messages array, which we did not send explicitly. This got sent by default, and this is the data that we have sent additionally with that key as prompt, and this is the latest input that the user has typed in. So as you can tell, this as more and more messages will be sent back and forth between this API and this client, this messages array is going to grow in size, and there will be role with user and there will be role with assistant, and this messages array is going to store the historical chat context that is relevant for this chat. So I'm going to go ahead and just get this prompt, the latest prompt, out of this additional payload that we sent. So I'm going to write prompt const prompt is equal to request body dot data dot prompt. And this prompt I'm going to use to trigger the Gemini Pro API. Now, I agree that we are losing the historical chat context just by taking the latest input from the user, and we are not using the historical chat context that is stored in the messages array. In case you want to build a multi-turn chat use case, you can create a prompt out of the historical chat context that is present in the messages array, and you can send that prompt to trigger the Gemini API and get responses. So to trigger this Gemini Pro API, we'll have to first get an API token, and I'm going to search for Gemini Pro API and build with the Gemini API and ai.google.dev. That is the link you want to use, and you can go to the documents section first, but let's get the API key first from Google AI Studio. So I'm going to click on this link, and first time you will be asked to sign in. I am already signed in, so I'm going to directly go to this playground section where you can type some prompt and you can get responses and play around with it. But I'm going to go ahead and click on the get API key, and I have already created an API key, but if it is the first time, you can go ahead and click on this button, create API key. But I'm going to click on this link, and this is the API key that was generated from me. So I'm going to copy this and come to the root of my project and create a new file that is called .env. And I'm going to save this API key with the name Google_API_key, and I'm going to paste the API key that we just copied. So whenever we're creating .env file to store environment variables that are meant to be private, it is best practice to add that file inside the git ignore file as well. So whenever we will be deploying this project, if we want to deploy this project using GitHub, or just we want to push it to GitHub, we don't want this environment variables to be pushed into the GitHub. For that, I'm going to write .env in the git ignore file. That is going to make sure that this .env file gets excluded from our GitHub push. So back in the documentation, we have created the API key. I'm going to go ahead and click on this documentation button, and on the left side, I'm going to select Node.js, and if you scroll down, so we have received our API key. Now I'm going to go ahead and install this npm package, which will allow us to interact with this Gemini Pro API. So I'm going to copy this, stop the service by hitting Ctrl+C, and then Command K to clear the terminal, and then write that command. After that is installed, so as you can see, they have given some code examples. So I'm not going to require it like this. I'm just going to import it as a module. So on top of this API, I'm just going to write import Google Generative AI, import from Google Generative AI. And as you can see, first they are asking us to create an instance of that object that we just imported, and then query that object to get the model by specifying the model name. So let's do that. Let me write const gen AI is equal to new Google Generative AI instance. and it expects us to provide the API key. Since we stored it in the .env file, and Next.js is going to make sure that process.env contains that API key with the name that we specified. So we specified Google API key, so I'm going to use that, and it is saying that it can be string or undefined, but we know that we specified it in the .env file, so I'm going to use the assertion operator, that is the exclamation sign, and that is telling TypeScript that we know that this is going to be present in the runtime. Then I'm going to say const model is equal to gen AI dot get generative AI model, and this takes a config object with parameter model where we'll be specifying the model name as Gemini Pro. Now we'll be getting the response from this model, so I'm going to write streaming response is equal to model dot. So there are two methods, generate content and generate content stream. So we are interested in streaming of the response, so I'm going to use the generate content stream method, and this expects us to send the prompt, and this is an async function, so we'll have to await this. Now we can go ahead and send this streaming text response. Let me try to send this streaming response as an argument. We know that this expects a readable stream object, but this streaming text response has a type of generate content stream result, and that is not compatible. So for that, this AI SDK actually comes with a wrapper function. So I'm going to place a comma here and then place my cursor here and then hit control space and search for Google generative AI stream, and this is a wrapper function. So if I just copy this and go to this Vercel AI SDK documentation and search for it, so as you can see, it says that the Google generative AI stream function is a utility that transforms the output from Google's generative AI SDK into readable stream, and this is the object type that the streaming text response expects. So we are going to wrap this response that we received from this generative content stream, and that way we'll be able to send it back as a streaming text response. Now with that, our API implementation is done. Now back in the page, let me go ahead and try to print whatever is received inside this messages array. So I'm going to write, and this is a JSON object, so we'll have to stringify it first to show it as a string. So I'm going to write JSON stringify messages, and now I'm going to bring up the service by writing npm run dev. And as you can see, it shows that this is an empty array now, the messages array. So let me go ahead and write how are you. And as soon as we hit enter, you can see the messages array actually got populated with the input that we just typed in, and that message had a role of user, and then we had to wait for a few moments, and the response from the Gemini Pro API came along, and then that had a role of assistant, and as and when these response tokens were received, this content started getting larger and larger. So let me write something else. Tell me a story. So as soon as we hit enter, as you can see that this got populated with the user, with the role user, but this one has a role of assistant, the one that we are receiving from the API. And as and when the response tokens are received, this content keeps increasing in size. That means our streaming is technically working. Now all there is left to do is loop over this messages array and show each of those message objects in a nicely formatted div, so that it stops looking like this gibberish text and starts looking like a nicely formatted chat box that you'd expect. Now let's start building the render messages section, and for this I'm going to go to this function render messages, and here inside the div I'm going to give it some class name. So I'm going to write flex column, and I'm going to use flex column reverse because the first message should be displayed at the last and only the last message is going to be at the top, so that the user only gets to see the message that were generated just right now, and the user can scroll down to see the older messages. And I'm also going to use with full text left margin top of 4, so that there is a space between the form and the messages section, and gap of 4, so that between each of those message boxes there are a gap of about 16 pixels. And I'm going to use white space pre-wrap. That means whenever these responses from this Gemini Pro API come with white spaces, that can be either tabs or new lines, those are preserved while displaying this on our Next.js page. And also we are saying if required, wrap the content. Now inside this div I'm going to go over this messages array, and I'm going to use the messages.map method. It takes a lambda function, and within this lambda function it gets m as a message and index of the message inside that array. and we are going to return a div that is going to be the message box for that specific message. I'm going to get rid of this stringified message, and then inside this chat box I'm going to start writing class name. I'm going to give it a padding of 4, shadow MD, rounded MD, so that the corners of the chat box are rounded. And also I'm going to check if this message is from the user or the assistant, and in case it is from user, I'm going to give it a slightly different background. So for that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to wrap this text in curly braces, and I'm going to use the tilde notation so that we can inject expression into this string. So I'm going to give it a space here, and then here I'm going to write dollar and curly braces, and inside this curly braces I can inject any expression that is going to resolve to a string, and that is going to be appended to the string that comes before that. So here I'm going to check if m.role is equivalent to user, then this expression should resolve to bg stone 300. So we're going to give it a background stone 300, and if it's not user, then this is going to resolve to just nothing. That means the default background will be applied. And inside this div, we are going to show this m.content, which will be the text of the message. So I'm going to save it and refresh this page, and I'm going to type, and you can see this is the user message, and then the message from the assistant is shown just above that. Now I'm going to show a small icon on the left side to denote whether it is from the user or from the assistant. And for that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give this message box a margin left of 10, so that we make some space on the left side where the icon will be placed. And I'm going to give it a relative positioning so that we can place the icon absolutely inside this div, and I'm going to give it a left attribute to be -10, so that we created a space of 40 pixel by writing this margin left of 10, and we are going to add the icon inside this div that will have a left attribute of -10, that will be -40 pixel, and since it will be placed absolutely, so it will be outside this div. So I'm going to go ahead and write that inside this div, and first I'm going to check if the role is user. Then I'm going to give it a user icon that is coming from Lucid React, and I'm going to use this user2, and as we said that this will be placed absolutely, so I'm going to give it a class name absolute, and I'm going to give it top of 2 and minus left -10. So it is going to be, sorry, this will be -10. And if it is not user, in that case we are going to show a bot icon, and we're going to give it the same class name. If you type something, you'll see the icon is there, and for the user the bot icon is there. So let me give some little bit more styling to this. So I'm going to give it a rounded border, so I'm going to say border rounded full, padding of 1, and give it a shadow large, and I'm going to give it this give the bot the same class names. I think I missed the absolute here. And for the bot, I'm going to give it the same blue color, so I'm going to say stroke, and this is the blue color that we used. So this is how you can define specific values. You can specify using the square brackets. So inside that I'm going to write hashtag and then that hex code. So that is how the bot will have a slightly blue stroke color. Now we want to check when the generation is in process. We want to give some sort of cues to the user, and for that what we can do is that this useChat comes with some other handlers. So if we hit control space here, you can see that it comes with isLoading, which is going to tell us if it is loading or not, and it also comes with a stop handler. So if you call the stop method anytime, then that is going to stop the generation process. So I'm going to use this isLoading to show some sort of cues. First of all, this placeholder I'm going to show generating when this generation is in process. So here also I'm going to make this placeholder conditional. So I'm going to wrap it inside curly braces, and then I'm going to check is loading. If it is loading, then I'm going to show generating. Also, if it is loading, then I'm going to say it is disabled. So disabled is equal to is loading. So if I write something, you can see when this is disabled, it shows a gray background. Let me change that. So we can do that easily by saying when disabled, don't make the background gray, rather keep the background transparent. So that way when you'll be writing tell me a story, we don't see any gray background, and this is disabled. We cannot place our cursor inside it. Now let the user give an option to stop this generation process. So we are going to show a loading icon here in the send button, and when the user clicks on that button, this is going to allow the user to stop the generation process. So inside the render form method, when we are showing this button, and inside that we are showing a send icon, we are going to check if it is loading. Then we are going to show a loader icon, loader2, and we're going to give it the same class name that we gave to the send button. And if it is not loading, then we're going to show this send button, send icon. That way if we write we're going to see the loading icon. Now to give it animation, it is very easy to do that using Tailwind utility class. So I'm going to write animate pin, and that way if we write, we can see this is the loading icon. Now to allow the user to stop it, it's very easy. We can just add a on-click handler on this icon. So I'm going to write on-click stop. So that is the handler that we received from the useChat, and we're calling it on the loader icon. So whenever user will click on it, this will stop the generation process. So I'm going to check that by writing tell me a story. And when the generation is happening, I can stop it in between the generation process. Now I'm going to give it a bounce effect to this bot just to show that this is alive. I like that effect. So I'm going to go to the render messages section, and when we are showing the bot, that we can give this bot an animate bounce utility class. That way the bot will be bouncing, but we want to make it conditional. So for that reason, I'm going to use the same approach that we did earlier. I'm going to wrap this text inside a curly braces, and I'm going to use tilde notation so that we can inject conditional expressions inside it. And then I'm going to give space and then dollar and curly braces, and inside here I'm going to check if it's loading and if the index of the message is the last message. So basically we don't want, whenever it is loading, we don't want all the bots to be bouncing. Only the message that is in the process of generation at this moment, only that bot should be bouncing. So that is why we are checking if the index of the message is equal to messages.length -1. So if this is the last message, in that case we are going to give it animate bounce class name so that the bot will start bouncing. If not, that is not the case, then we are just going to leave it blank. Now if you ask that, we will see the bot is bouncing when for the message that is in the process of generation. Now we have covered a lot here. We have built a Next.js application that streams responses from Google's Gemini Pro API, and the responses are printed as and when they are generated. We are also giving the user an ability to stop the generation process in between. Now all there's left to do is to handle markdowns. So the Gemini Pro API also sends text with markdown syntax. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if I ask a question, what are the downsides of AI? You see it comes with this double star, which in markdown syntax means bold letters, and there can be sometimes headings that comes with hashtags, and there can be italics which comes with a single star. So to handle this kind of markdowns, we are going to have to use an external library that is going to allow us to convert this markdown into appropriate HTML. For example, this double star has to be converted into bold tag, and italic has to be converted into emphasis tag, and so on. And this is also applicable for links. For example, if I ask share some links, so as you can see, it does give us the links, but these are not clickable links. So we want to parse this HTML and we want to generate A tags from these links. So to do that, we are going to use Markdown it, an external NPM package. So I'm going to go to Markdown it. As you can see, this is one of the more popular libraries. You can check their API documentation and see what are the options they are available. So first you'll have to import in it like this, and then you'll have to create an instance and then just call render method on it by passing on the text. And the text will be, in our case, the messages content, which will be passing inside it, and then we'll be able to render this as an HTML, which it will actually convert it into an HTML object, and then React will be able to interpret it as HTML tag, and it will be rendered accordingly. Let's do that. Let me go ahead and install it using this command. So I'm going to stop the service here by hitting Ctrl+C and then Command K to clear the terminal. Then I'm going to write that command, and I'm not going to write any markdown code here. Rather, I'm going to create an external component for this. So inside the app, I'm going to go ahead and create component/markdown.tsx. So this is going to create a component inside the app directory. Inside that there will be a markdown tsx file. Here I'm going to use tsrafce, the ES7 plus snippet, just to get a boilerplate component, and I'm going to name my component as markdown. And inside this props, that it will be receiving whenever this markdown component will be used. So what we want to do is that we want to use this markdown component in our page.tsx file right here. Here we want to use it like this, markdown, and then we want to have a parameter onto which we will be passing the m.content, and whenever this m.content is going to change, and that is going to change whenever we are receiving this response from the API. React is going to make sure that this component is re-rendered, and whenever it is re-rendered, we are going to run this code from Markdown so that it gets converted into HTML, and React renders it as appropriate HTML tags. So with that approach, let me first get a text parameter as input prop here. So that is going to be of type string. This is going to be that means this props is going to have a text inside it. So we are destructuring the input property here just to get the text out of it, and then we are going to write const HTML content, and we are going to have to import this Markdown. So I'm going to go to the documentation here. So I'm going to have to import Markdown it. Actually, this does not come because this requires us to install a definition package that comes as a separate package just to satisfy the TypeScript, because the TypeScript cannot find the declaration file for this. So we'll have to install this definition file. So I'm going to copy this command and then paste it here. That way TypeScript will be able to resolve it. So on top of this component, we are going to write const markdown is equal to, we are going to have to instantiate it, and here we are going to say markdown.render, and this is going to be the text that whatever we are receiving as an input prop for this markdown component. And here we could write HTML content, but what will happen is that React is going to interpret this HTML content as text. So even if this HTML content has a tag like B, and inside that there is something like this is bold, this whole text is going to be printed by React. For that, what we'll have to do is that we'll have to set the HTML using another attribute which is called dangerously set inner HTML, and it requires us to use this specific syntax. The reason this syntax is a little bit difficult is because when you are setting this dangerously set inner HTML, React wants you to go to their documentation and read about it so that you know exactly what you are doing. Let me just write it first, then I will explain how we can make sure this is not unsafe. We are going to have to set this as HTML content, and it cannot have a children in that case, because the children is going to be the HTML content that React is going to dangerously set. So now this HTML content, setting this HTML content is not very safe option, because HTML content can have something like this B tag, and this can be, this is bold, but the thing is that this can also have some scripts like on error. It can run some kind of JavaScript, and that can lead to cross-site scripting, which is not very safe. So for that reason, we'll have to sanitize the HTML. Whenever we are setting the inner HTML using this property, it is always recommended that you sanitize it. So we are going to use the most popular package DOM purifier for this. Although in the documentation of Markdown it, they have mentioned that by default they make sure that they sanitize it. So let me show you that. So if you go to their npm documentation, you can see that it is safe by default. If I click on this, they mention that they take an approach where this is sanitized by default, and they are saying that there are two approaches. Obviously, if you enable HTML, then you will have to use external sanitizer package, but if you don't enable HTML, then you don't have to use external sanitize package. And what they mean by enabling HTML is that you can actually pass along certain parameters here. So if I hit control space here, you'll see that there is an HTML tag, and if you hover over it, it says that set true to enable HTML tags in source. Be careful, this is not safe, because in this case you will have to use external sanitizers. We haven't set it, so by the documentation it should be safe by default, but in either case I'm going to go ahead and use the DOM purifier on this HTML content just to be on the safer side. So I'm going to go ahead and install this DOM purify package. So as you can see, this is also one of the most popular packages, and if you scroll down, they have given an example what it actually does. So as we were talking about image, and then on error there is an alert, and which is basically a JavaScript. There can be scripts added along with the HTML, so that makes it unsafe, and this DOM purifier makes sure that this is sanitized. And as you can see, this is the script tags, and whatever JavaScript were there, they are removed, and it outputs just the pure HTML. So that is what we're going to do here. We'll first install this package using this command, and then simply use the DOM purify and sanitize call, and then we're going to say const sanitized, import this first, import DOM purify. And it also requires an additional declaration file to be installed just for the TypeScript. So I'm going to install that as well. That is going to resolve that compilation error. And then we are going to just write DOM purify.sanitize. and pass along that HTML content. And we're going to set this sanitized HTML as the argument for this dangerously set inner HTML. That way we'll be able to parse this markdown using this markdown component while being on the safer side. So now all that's left to do is use this markdown component in our page.tsx file. So we're going to go to this our page, and in place of just writing this text as we received it, we are going to say markdown, and if I hit tab, it is going to auto import it. And as we know, it has a required property which is text, which we defined there, and this is going to be the m.content. Now if we go ahead and run this app by writing npm run dev, then refresh our page, I'm going to write what are the cons of AI. Actually, I did a mistake. I kept this m.content, so we'll have to remove that. And if we refresh now, and I'm going to write what are the cons of AI, you can see that our markdown is nicely formatted. Now let's see how the links are formatted. So I'm going to ask for share some links of good articles. So as you can see, we can hover over it, and on the bottom left you can see that these are detected as links because these are A tags. I can right click on it and inspect it. So if I inspect each of these elements, you can see these are actually A tags. This HTML was generated by this markdown it npm package, so that is good, but we want to show this with a different color. So for that, I'm going to go to the first, what I'm going to do is that for the chat box, I'm going to add an ID to it. I'm going to call it chat box, just so that when we are defining our CSS, we want to be very specific that CSS rule applies only in the chat box. So I'm going to go to this global.css file where we are going to define hashtag chatbox, and inside that, whenever there is an A tag, we're going to say color, and we're going to use that same blue color that we are using in our page. And we are also going to make this bold. So I'm going to say font weight bold. That way the user will know that these are clickable links. User will be able to click it and navigate to that page. And with that, our app is done. If you want to learn how you can deploy this app so that everybody can use it, then do check out my video on how to deploy Next.js application on Vercel. And as always, thank you for watching till the end.